Hello, my name is Bill Heise. This video is being made 2 days after the November 2020 election, in which Donald Trump won the election by 5 million votes by the last count I've seen. And the conservatives are, happy, and the liberals are pointing fingers. And I'm making this video to make a point about the future, because the conservatives think they're going to be in power forever. They're not. The liberals think they're going to be out of power forever. They're not. But the liberals do have to do some rethinking, and the conservatives, as is the want of people who win elections, should do more thinking for themselves. They probably won't. I would liken that election that we had this week to the election of 1972, when Richard Nixon, who was really the equivalent of Donald Trump, nobody liked him, everybody distrusted him, everybody thought he was a bad guy, but he won by using strategies that people thought were suspect, but they still worked. And McGovern, who was the idealistic candidate, lost, and he lost big. And so I think the same thing happened in 2024. The 1972 campaign is very different than the circumstances we live in 2024. However, I don't see that either side of the political aisle sees it that way. And I want to make my case from my way of looking at the world, rather than the us versus them way that the political parties in this country look at the world. Because I don't look at the world that way. I look at the world, well, first of all, I've written a book, which I'll publish in a couple weeks, maybe a month, about writing, the most boring topic in the world. If you had to read a book on writing or anything else, you'd read a book on anything else. So at the beginning of that book, I started out trying to make the case of why I thought my book was worth reading. And it turned into a whole separate book. But basically, the book is about how we got how we got to 2024, where we are now. And in my view, what happened after World War II, you had people who had gotten so disgusted by the ability of the hierarchical structure of Europe to make it possible for people to say in the Nuremberg trials, I was only following orders. And that takes all the responsibility out of the agent who performs the act and puts it all on somebody outside of themselves. And after World War II, the cities of Europe were devastated, and the people in Europe, the best intellectuals, went to the Soviet Union and to America. And the education system in America turned into a system where people could reconfigure what I call the one-to-many system, where there's one guy at the top and many people at the bottom who feed the guy at the top. And in Germany, which is the arch enemy, not only in 1972 but 2020, Kamala Harris called Donald Trump Hitler, and that's an old trope at this point. But the reason it's an old trope is because it works, but it's also a way of, at this point, a way of drawing a circle around things and then saying, if you don't agree with us, then you're one of them. So you draw a circle you make a litmus test for people, or they called it in the Bible a shibboleth, and then you decide, are you with us or against us? If you're not, you're one of them. Them need to be lectured to, but they don't need to be listened to. So by 2024, there's three major things you can call somebody: a sexist, a racist, and a fascist. And if you want to be personal, you call them Hitler. So at this point, that's all that is. People don't even know what fascism is. They don't really care what fascism is. If they want to call somebody a totalitarian or somebody who takes too much control of things, call them a fascist. If they want to make room for themselves without thinking through the reasons why they want to do things, they call you a sexist or a racist. And I've been called all those things in my life. I don't like it. Don't think it means anything. And I got through 8 years of graduate school on that basis of just ignoring that. I couldn't just ignore it, but I basically ignored it, and it went away because it's not real. And 8 years in graduate school with everybody, it started on the first day of graduate school in 1988, in August of 1988, the month that Rush Limbaugh came on the air. My teacher, who had been touting this expansive view of the world in which all learners had to learn in their own way. And some people are kinetic learners, which means you learn with your hands. Some people are oral learners, which means you're better off hearing things. And some people are visual learners. She had just expressed this idea on the first morning, the first day of class, of an all-day writing class that was held the week before classes started for new teachers, to learn how to teach. And I raised my hand and I said, well, I learned to write by outlining. And this woman, in the month that Rush Limbaugh came in the air, I'm sure she never heard of him, looked at me, I'm a white guy, obviously, I'm a male, looked down at the sheet, saw my last name is Heise, looked back at me and said, well, we're not going to have that in this class. That's how Nazis teach. That was 1988. I've lived with that for 8 years in graduate school. I've lived with that accusation forever. I don't like it. I get used to it. Take a different slice of that. I'm a man. And men are used to being the target of marketing jokes. If you watch, right now I'm watching YouTube a lot, and I was seeing somebody was talking about the fact that they had all their clothes they had in boot camp. I remember thinking, oh yeah, another guy just being trod on, so the women who do have all the purchasing power can feel good about themselves and they'll buy more stuff. Okay, I got used to that when I was 11. I'm used to it now. It's just the way it is. Don't particularly like it, but like being called a Nazi, I can get around it because I know how the world actually works. So after being called a Nazi, before I ever heard of Rush Limbaugh, I started to think there's something wrong with the way we teach English. And so I wrote a book about my new way of thinking about the world. It's not just about writing. It's more a book about how the American way that was translated out of Europe into what I call one-to-many Europe, where everybody could avoid responsibility, to one-to-one America, where every person who has a vote can have access to their personal truth. And now I'm using catchwords that have caught on just because of this one-to-one model, which I call the standard model, is so universal. And both sides of the political aisle use the same standard model. standard model, basically, I'll go into this more detail in a future video, is that there's an external world of facts. You draw that fact into your interior mind. You add some personal sense that you draw from your interior mind, which I call the private domain, and then take that mixture and report it back into the public domain. And then, unfortunately, the public domain has argument as part of its culture, which academia, and I think rightly, but doesn't have argument as part of its culture, because they want to clear the space for people to explore new and sometimes fundamentally maybe not catchy, dodgy ideas. And then you argue them out then you argue them out in the private domain, public domain. Unfortunately, they never theorized the public domain in the standard model. So it's a 4-step model. You report it into the world, and then there are various things that show up in the world to deal with the fact that there's no ability to discern good ideas in a one-to-one model. So you have safe spaces, and that's not the way you deal with things. You deal with things in the real world. You deal with things by, some people have good ideas, like me, who've written a book about writing that everybody should read. And there's some people in the world who have bad ideas, like Hitler, who thought maybe the way to get through the world is just to kill all the Jews. Bad idea. I grew up in a town where I was told that it was 50% Jewish, and all my friends were Jewish in that town. And I would die before I'd let anybody kill any of my best friends. And yet I was called a Nazi, because it doesn't really matter what I think or do or say. That tag is just there to make me look bad. So I'm outside the circle. I'm one of them. And for me, forever, since the 80s, when I got into graduate school, and I got out of graduate school, I have a PhD in medieval and Renaissance literature. It was really great. I mean, the amount of knowledge I have about stupid stuff is amazing. But I got out of graduate school in 1996. Decided I didn't want to go into academia because it was not competitive. And I'm a competitive guy, and they just were not going to let me succeed in that. Again, this is terrible, but they got rid of the hierarchical structure when they brought everything from one-to-many Europe to one-to-one America, but they didn't get rid of it in academia. So the people in 1972, that was the height of modernism, basically, the height of the new American way. In Europe, there were people in the 60s especially singing songs about how great America was. There's a woman named France Gall, my favorite pop star from the 1960s France, who sang a song about America and how it just had these great windows you could look in, and they weren't bombed out like the cities were in Europe. It was a great era, and it was the era of American ascendancy. And that era lasted to 1972, and the old guys who were still using old, outdated things, and they had elected leaders who just started listing casualties in Vietnam and telling everybody we're winning because our casualties are less than theirs. And yet the people who had to get drafted in that war, they were really upset, and they staged a revolution, and they kicked President Nixon out of office, and they installed themselves into the means of information distribution. That is politics, the media, and academia. And then they stopped, because now they'd reached the pinnacle of all things. I believe that's still not the end of all things, but they really did. I mean, they've been, I can cite, and I will cite as I go into more detail about what I'm going to talk about in my videos here. There are all sorts of ways in which the culture moved forward, but politics, media, and academia did not. And so I think that by 2024, when we have a new election, and Democrats once again have lost, using their idealistic principles that they invested in with George McGovern in 1972. They're going back to the same tired playbook they used in 1972, and it's a mistake. This time, things have changed drastically. It's a mistake to go back and do what you did in 2016, burning down cities, recreating the chaos of the 60s. What happened instead, in my view, is that in 1980, after getting rid of Nixon, installing Ford in the presidency for a couple of years, and then getting Jimmy Carter elected, I think liberals thought, once again, we finished the trend of history. We've reached its end. And we now just have to clean up, lecture them, but never listen to them. And that's half the country now. And we'll be in charge forever. We just have to, lecture them. So in academia, they started to lecture people without listening to them. Again, bad idea, but they did that. And they never have stopped doing that on the left. In 1980, Reagan figured out the Standard Model. And he thought, and this is the key that tears everything apart, he thought the unified Standard Model, which had a one-to-one relationship between truth and being, knowledge and being, knowledge and truth are ostensibly the same thing in the 70s. He thought, well, we have the perfect relationship between knowledge and being. He drew a circle and said, they, or them, they don't understand. So we have to lecture them. So now you have two people who believe the same thing, but each of them draws a circle and says, we're lecturing them, but we'll never listen to them. That's 1980. In 1984, that was just to give you some context, in the 70s, the biggest ad in the world was, I like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. That was the one-to-one relationship that the young people were going to carry forward with a Coca-Cola in their hand. And, the Pepsi generation, you can think of things in not generational terms, you can think about things in generational terms, but in broad categorical terms. That's how they marketed things in the 70s, using the product of mass marketing, which is, again, a huge, I'm not sure where it was invented, but it came to fruition in America. And America is still the best place in the world to get stuff. It's spread even to China at this point. We tore down the Berlin Wall, but America's still the shopping mecca of the world. And their economy is bigger than anybody else's per capita because of that. And so what happens is Steve Jobs comes along and says, I want to continue that one-to-one pattern, because there are still things in the world that aren't distributed equally. So what he said is, he gave us, in 1984, he gave us the idea that you could give everybody what they want and not the same thing. If you like to play Legos, you could buy Legos. If you didn't like Legos, you could buy building blocks or whatever. And everybody got the choice on their own to choose what they wanted. That turned the entire marketing pyramid, the one-to-many marketing pyramid, where the guy at the top could tell everybody, this is what we're going to sell in the stores today. Turned it upside down. So now the CEO of a company had to listen to what consumers were telling him, and then they stocked that. So if this way people wanted to buy purple toothpaste, they'd say, we're going to stock purple toothpaste because we can sell more of that and bring more money. That's a huge difference between mass marketing, which is pre-1984, and mass and niche marketing, which is post-1984. And you can say my dates are too firm and it's not really that strict. But for the most part, it took until 1999 for Business Week to catch on to the things that used to work aren't working anymore, and you have to figure out what you're going to do instead. So what happens after 1984 is that outside the world, in the outside world, I dropped out of college in 1981, not because I wasn't smart, because I didn't know how to catch up to what other people already knew. And I dropped out of college. I caught up by reading and outlining. And by outlining, I could, say, well, this part of this paragraph is more important than this. And I had to really think about every sentence and its relationship to other sentences. And it's a grammatical thing, and I'm really good at that. But it took me a lot of effort to learn that. And then when I got into graduate school, the one-to-one teacher who got a job over me in the hierarchy, she decided that was me being a fascist. Now, there's no way she could know anything about me. That offended me to no end, but it offended me more because it wasn't based on any interior thing I had in me. It's the same thing that happened in the 1970s when Robert McNamara, the whiz kid who was brought into the government by, I think it was John F. Kennedy, as the Secretary of Defense, started compiling those lists. There's no individual in that categorization. It's just an abstract thought. And individuals who have to die for abstract thoughts get really unhappy really fast. And I think after a while, the marketing people were in the top of the hierarchy, the remaining hierarchies on Madison Avenue, got too comfortable. Steve Jobs wrote a brilliant ad in which he managed to throw a hammer through a television screen, and the people who were just sitting there as passive receivers of information from the top were stunned, and everybody in the caption was, why 1984 won't be like 1984. And that was a stunningly brilliant ad, but it threw a wrench into everything. It took years. I said 1999 Business Week finally figured it out, put it on the cover. I think it was February. I'm not sure. I can't remember the date. But at that point, the people who got into academia during the age of mass marketing, politics, media, including Hollywood, and academia, they want to give up their power to somebody. So they'll talk about Steve Jobs being a genius, but they don't actually put his one-to-one proposition in place because they know more. They're experts. They know more than novices do. And so even though the principle of America is built on the notion of unalienable rights, in academia, politics, and media, people want others to alienate their power to them, and they will do the acting out for them. So it splits the value proposition between consumers of value who pay and consumers of value who pay and producers of value who receive money or whatever. So my book is all about how to learn, because it's a process I had to learn. It takes a while to get from being a passive consumer to an active producer. And so everybody should read my book. Thank you for buying it in advance. It's not going to cost you very much. Anyway, back to my point. After 2000, after 1984, I went back to school because I had a problem with the centralized one-to-one standard model. Had not figured out the terms I was going to use that I used in 2024 yet. But I had a problem. I couldn't figure things out. I'll talk about that in a separate video. But so I went back. I still believe that somebody in academia knew the answers I was looking for. So I went back, and did really well. I took my tests, and I think I got a 97. I know I got a 97% on the GRE general test for English. I got a 98% on the now defunct lit test, and I didn't study for either of those. I was just really dedicated student. And so I got into graduate school, and on my first day of graduate school, I was called a Nazi by somebody who didn't know anything about my inalienable mind at all. It made me mad. Because I never heard of Rush Limbaugh, I started thinking about how things had gone wrong. And so when I look at 2024, and I put it in terms of 1972, I see the Democrats doing the same thing they did when Trump won the first time. They created him as one of the people outside, and he is an outsider. He never ran for public office before. And they say we have to lecture him, but we never listen to him. And so I think at this point that's a mistake. And the reason I think it's a mistake is that both sides of the aisle, the political aisle, are using the same philosophical structure. And the way I'd put this to people who follow politics, and I hope people on the left understand this, but I know people on the right understand this, that Andrew Breitbart once said that politics is downstream from culture, which means that politics follows the larger world of culture. And the larger world of culture is such that if you can capture the culture, you can capture people in politics. So I'm going to make a video about this one day, not soon, but one day, about Cardi B and all these people who just have 1 or 2 billion responses on a video that they've made, and what it means to be in charge of culture. Lately, especially given the fact that conservatives have won the presidency again, and Democrats are ramping up to rebel and revolt and do things like they learned to do in the 60s. I think it's, as I said before, I think it's a mistake. I think what neither side of the political aisle or even the cultural aisle understands is that politics follows culture, but culture follows philosophy. And in the philosophical terms, both sides of the political aisle, despite there being at the political level absolute opposites, at the philosophical level, they're both using the same model. They both believe that us know everything, that them know nothing, that us should lecture them. If you look at Al Franken in 2000, he wrote a book about Rush Limbaugh being a big fat idiot. Listen to me, he said, and you'll know the truth. Listen to him, and you'll know nothing but falsehood. If I flick the switch of the radio over to Rush Limbaugh, he says exactly the same thing. So that divides people without solving the problem. And I solved the problem. But the problem is to come up with a different system. And I think if by temperament, I'm a Democrat. Fiscally, I'm all with the Republicans, so I'm one of those people that Rush Limbaugh used to trash all the time as being, an independent who doesn't really understand the importance of politics. And I never, as much as I listened to Rush Limbaugh, and I did until the day he died, I never really bought into his sense that he had the end and that there's no point in listening to the other side. So I always listen to both sides, and I take both sides into account as not as something I need to understand because I'm trying to win an argument with the other side. Because, as I said, politics in my eyes is just blood sport. And so what I look at when I look at politics is I look at it as being like bread and circuses for people who are never going to matter in life, but want to have something they can hold on to feel like they matter. And in ancient Rome, we had bread and circuses, and now we have Trump won in this last election on the price of bread, abstractly, but he won the high prices. And Kamala Harris won on joy in an environment where people were not feeling that much joy. But to go back to the old 1972 reaction, which is to kick the bad guy out so that us on the liberal side can lecture to but never listen to the other side. That's a bad idea. It was a bad idea in 1972, but it was on the cutting edge of culture in 1972. In 2024, you need to do more. My suggestion to people, even though it's going to take them a long time, and even though I was a teacher for 30 years and I know that people don't listen to me when I say this, my suggestion is you take me more seriously than people in my classroom generally do. Listen to what I say about how both sides of the political aisle are on the same side, and maybe adjust your philosophy to my, I think, better distributed model. I'll talk about that more in a future video. That's all for now. Thank you for listening. My name is Bill Heise. If you want to find me on Amazon, my name is listed as William E. Heise. Talk to you tomorrow. Thank you for listening. Bye.